Welcome, everyone, to episode number 60 of Underserved. Today, we are featuring Conrad Morgan, Director of Engineering, Retail Systems at Rue Gilt Group. Let's get started.
Welcome to this week's edition of Underserved, the podcast for the rest of the tech industry, where we focus on stories of tech industry leaders, their insights, and their lessons learned. And now, your host, Andrew Jelina.
Hey, Conrad, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Andrew, thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell me, if you could, what got you interested in computers when you were a youth?
When I was a youth, fond memories of this time, I think back to my childhood, and I don't think a lot of thoughts and have a lot of memories of luxury items, right? And back when I was a kid, having a personal computer in your home was definitely considered a luxury. So when I first got my hands on a computer and could actually start tinkering with it, I think I was around 11 or 12 years old. I saw Windows 95 for the first time and got to play things like the old Snake game. I don't know if you remember that one or not, but that was a classic growing up, especially if you had one of those old school Nokia phones. Amazing game. I could spend hours doing that, but I was able to actually see that kind of come to life for the first time. And as I was playing those games, I was like, I just wonder, how does this kind of stuff work? How do computers work? How does software work? And it just kind of started giving me that itch that I felt like I needed to scratch. And from there, I just kind of started looking at what different computers could do. And, I didn't have a lot of resources at my disposal to go do it. So it was kind of this dwelling period. We got our first PC, I was around 11 or 12. I built my first computer when I was about 17. So in those years, I just did a lot of research and tried to understand what was going on in the tech world. And from there, it just, kind of developed into this hobby that I spent a lot of time doing.
So you became a PC builder. Are you taking like recycled and discarded parts and making a Franken machine?
Oh, absolutely. That was the first full build that I did. It was taking some of my old computer parts that I had from that first PC, taking some from other family members and even some friends, anything I could get my hands on. If I could add it to the computer that I had, I did. And I don't even remember all the different components, but it was pretty ridiculous. It looked definitely like a Frankenstein machine. There's no question about it.
It reminds me, like, you hear stories of the car tinkerers from the 50s or 60s. Then, later in the 90s and aughts, there's everyone doing the same thing with PCs.
Oh, absolutely. That was exactly me, right? Anytime I would find myself with an hour or two to spare, you could find me taking apart my computer for no reason other than to put it back together, right? And I'm sure that probably resonates with some of those folks that were doing the car tinkering. If they hear me say that, I'm sure it resonates with them, right?
I don't know of a way to race your PCs for pink slips, though.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You could maybe bet some online gaming.
Speaking of that, this is around the time that you got into Counter-Strike, right?
Absolutely. That was one of my favorite games. That was coming out of my earlier childhood where we had GoldenEye 007 on Nintendo 64. That was amazing, right? And so I never got a chance to play that as a kid unless I was over at a friend's house. And so when Counter-Strike came out, I actually had a machine that could run it. I was smitten from day one, right? First person shooter, high definition graphics for the day. It was just incredible. Started playing that a lot. I actually got into the Cyber Athlete Amateur League for a little while with one of the clans that I was a part of. And, I know that word, the clan, I always feel awkward these days saying that, but that was the way we describe our groups of people that all played together. And it was a lot of fun. Yeah, Counter-Strike was definitely my jam.
And then you get into high school. Do you end up taking classes in it or just kind of tinkering on your own?
No classes other than some of the required ones, typing and that type of stuff, but nothing more traditional in computer science or anything like that. Most of my time was spent just tinkering on the side, doing my own research, reading in libraries, kind of learning on the job, so to speak. That's really where I got most of my experience on that front.
You did take some programming classes in college, though, right?
Yes. Yeah, I did. My first one, I'll never forget it. It was a class learning C++. It was the intro to C++ class. And the first time I ever actually wrote software, I wrote your generic DOS style calculator, terminal prompts, enter 2, enter operator, right? Like just super, super basic input output. And that was like just the coolest thing to me to be able to actually make something come to life in that way.
And then you decided, all right, you had a couple revelations about software and hardware at the time.
I definitely did. I'm sure there's other people that have had similar revelations to me, but there were two that really stood out. The first is, as I used games like Counter-Strike, as I started building basic DOS calculators, the first revelation to me was that software is definitely more interesting. Hardware is rather finite. You're reliant on the capabilities of manufacturers, but software, it's kind of open ended. You can do a lot of really interesting things with it. And so that was the first thing. Hardware, great, a lot of fun to tinker with, but software, that's really where you can let your creative juices flow. And the second one was just as I started going down the hardware track, I started realizing that all of the jobs that were out there were just kind of low paying, didn't really offer a lot of upward mobility. It was just kind of a saturated area of the overall IT market. As I looked at that, I was like, that doesn't sound like what I want to do. I don't want to be, in there hating life and dealing with desktop support and stuff like that for $10 an hour. It's like I could go flip cheeseburgers down at the local restaurant and make that much money. And at least then I'd have some interesting people to talk to throughout the day and not just have people hate me all day. Decided this software was probably where I'd really like to spend more of my time at that point.
And what is your first professional experience in software?
First one, arguably, it's not quite as extensive, but it was a really interesting way to begin to scratch that itch in a professional manner. Back in 2007, 2008, I started working as a process control engineer for a nuclear gauging systems company. So I was traveling all over the country, looking at all of our different client installations and doing maintenance on nuclear gauging devices, right? But we, as an organization, we actually not only supplied the hardware that ran these gauging systems in these variety of different industries, we also built the software, the interface between the machines, the actual nuclear gauging system itself, all the way back to corporate systems where they could do data analysis and reporting and things like that. So all of that interface software was kind of my first real entry into what it meant to write software and to be able to do things in that professional way. Got exposed to a lot of different manufacturing type of facilities, right? Things like fiberglass, things like wallpaper, carpet. It's a lot of things you don't really ever think about how that's made. But when you get to see it firsthand, it's a really neat experience. And then being able to get involved with the actual production of it and being able to write some software that helps actually control the machines and do real-time adjustments. It was just a really fascinating way to kind of enter the world of software and coding.
So is this software doing like polling, or is it event driven, or?
That's a really great question. So everything that we were working with was really event-driven software. And so, in manufacturing facilities, you typically see a lot of like PLCs, programmable logic controllers. Those are real popular. You probably even hear them referenced as ladder logic. And they're good for a lot of things, but they don't respond well to changes in the environment real time. It has to go through the entire ladder before it gets back to another input check for something. And so what we were working with were automation controllers that were sort of listening and scanning for different events that are happening within all of its inputs. And when it senses something that changes, it goes ahead and fires over to that. And then it responds by doing whatever it is that you write that particular automation controller to do. And so when we're looking at the different inputs that we'd have to have, things like temperature, moisture, all these different things that would maybe come into play. Anytime one of those things would change, we'd have to fire off something else and be able to actually respond to that. Most of those automation controllers we were running, they were doing these scans. I believe, it's been a little while, but it was like 50 microseconds was every check that it would do across all of its inputs. And so a lot of really interesting things that you can do with that kind of speed. Of course, 50 microseconds is nothing in modern day technology, but 15 years ago, that was definitely some interesting stuff.
I was screaming. Had you ever seen any technology PLCs before this? Any exposure to older tech?
No, not really. Like I said earlier, the first kind of real chance I got to really play with computers was back when I was around 11 or 12. But when I started getting into some of these different industries within this company, I saw some really, really interesting things. And it kind of brought up this. So let me take a step back. So I saw things like 8-inch floppy disks. I don't know if you remember 8-inch floppy disks, but that was pretty ridiculous. And then the mainframes that you would put this thing in were bigger than some rooms in my house. And I just looked at these, and I was a relatively young kid. I was in early 20s at this point. I'm looking at this just going, what? Like, this is what the world runs on? This is still what's out there? And for me, even though I was working with Windows 95 and that felt revolutionary to me, when I look back and think, oh, Windows 95 was light years ahead of 8-inch floppy drives. And I was just like, oh my word. It just was shocking to me even then. The old technology, number one, is built so robust that it's still running all these years later. But then number two, the companies haven't even updated. They're still just relying on this very old technology. So no real exposure to something like that until that job in the real professional industry.
You are listening to the Underserved podcast. Underserved is produced by Syrinx, the developer-founded, developer-run software consulting company. For more information, visit syrinx.com. That's SYRINX.com.
Yeah, if people have a big, expensive system that works, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They don't really want to do a big rewrite, so they'll try and Band-Aid and duct tape and keep that thing running as long as they can.
And they seem to be doing a pretty good job of it. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there right now that still have to interface with some of those old systems 40, 50, 60 years later.
So you had a bit of a breakthrough moment, though, when you made a fateful decision to become a warehouse temp at Amazon for the holidays?
Yeah, that was quite a transition, honestly. So right before joining up at Amazon, I was working at a company, and this is, mid 2009. So kind of coming out of a little bit of a recession. The company I was working for wasn't doing very well. I was the newest person that had been hired, first one to get let go as part of the reduction in force. And eventually, about 6 months after they let me go, they closed their doors entirely. So that kind of forced my hand at finding something else. I started looking. At this point, it was September, October 2009. And I'm looking for anything. So joining up at Amazon, there was a new warehouse not too far from where I lived at the time. And I was like, it's time. I'm going to go be, a warehouse worker. I'm going to spend the next 6 weeks, 8 weeks of my life just going and picking packages and things. Got to make sure that I can pay my bills, right? And I had no idea where I was going to go, what that role would offer me in the long term. I just knew I had to pay rent. And, so here I am. Applying and trying my best. So it was a weird transition to go from something that was a little bit more professional back down to something that didn't feel very professional. But I think it was a nice little reset to kind of build from a better foundation.
Well, Chris Sullivan, another underserved guest, said sometimes you got to step down to step up. So you don't end up picking and packing boxes for too long at Amazon, do you?
No, not at all, actually. The first 6 months I was there full time, I really spent a lot of time doing that. But there was an opportunity to step into a data analyst role, primarily doing different data analysis and research across inventory defects and trying to find trends in what's happening. And when that position became open, I did everything I could, hounded the hiring manager, bothered my direct manager, anything I could to try to get an opportunity to go fill that role because it sounded interesting to me. And at that time, coming out of the professional world and kind of tinkering with that and then having this opportunity, I was like, yeah, that's what I wanted. And so I went ahead and applied. But as time goes on, eventually they do offer me the role. So I was able to kind of transition into something that seemed a lot more interesting, gave me a little bit more satisfaction in what I was doing. And for that, I started kind of basic, helping build out some reports and digging into some of the surface level stuff. But as I got a little bit more involved, learn more about the systems, the software that we were running, what the data meant and how it was going to be used, I started figuring out ways that I could automate what I was doing in my job so that I could actually do other things that I wanted to do, like write new software and actually start tinkering with some web development for the first time and not just do your basic console applications. And so, really started digging into some of these reports that I was having to manually create and figured, okay, let's see how I can automate this, right? What's the kind of code that I would need to make this kind of thing work and where I don't have to do it and I get to do something fun like make something work and make the new shiny thing for our department. So I started looking at all the different things we were doing, wrote a lot of VBA scripts in Excel. I don't know if anybody else has spent a lot of time doing that, but man, that was the highlight of my day most days. Get in there, write a lot of software, figure out how Excel works and just try all these new things. And, it took me a few months, became kind of a really strong Excel expert on top of learning how to write VBA and do some of these coding things. And a lot of really neat opportunities came with that role.
Did you automate your way out of the job?
In some ways, absolutely. And I think that looking back, I'm glad that I did. By freeing up some of the time, it allowed me to do other things. Like I said, being able to write new automations and things, that was kind of one way that I was looking at a lot of what I was doing every day. And one other aspect of that whole role, I had a chance to kind of step in as an assistant manager of sorts for the department that I ran. And one thing that we used to do was call for overtime. Sure, no one's shocked to hear that Amazon fulfillment has overtime, especially when you talk about somewhere near the holidays. But when we called for overtime back in those days, it was all pen and paper, right? Hey, if anybody wants to work tomorrow, come sign up on this sheet of paper. And then, some people would get, a little funny. They'd take that piece of paper and never come back with it. They'd go throw it in the trash halfway across the warehouse or something. Now no one has to work overtime. Everybody's happy, right? It becomes this thing where it's really hard to manage and people forget to turn it into HR, et cetera. And so when I was filling in as the assistant manager, I kind of had to deal with that from time to time. And I hated that. I'm like, why are we using pen and paper? We're Amazon, right? Like, we're a huge company. Pen and paper is just ridiculous. And so that was kind of what led me to write my first real full suite of software, if that's what I could even really call it. It was pretty basic, but it was the first kind of real application that I'd built. And it was an overtime portal. And all it was a way for managers to go into the system and say, hey, I work in this department, on these days of the week. This is our shift code. I want people to be able to work a full shift of overtime on Thursday. Right. And then for people to be able to go in there from the other side and say, hey, I work on this shift and I'm looking for overtime. And then they could select it and just simply say, yep, I'll come work. It gave our ability to track the overtime, who was signed up, when they want to be, and what opportunities are out there even for the week later or 2 weeks later, right? Just kind of queue these things up. And on the backside, be able to report it out to HR and say, hey, these are the people. They were supposed to be here, right? And, as I started building that out, for our department, more departments started to get involved and say, hey, that's really cool. We'd love to have that. I started branching out into other departments within the building I was at. And then within a year, we had been using that software across our entire warehouse node across Indianapolis. Yeah, it was just really cool to see something that I built be used by thousands of employees at that point. And then, later on, after a couple more years, it actually got picked up as a real software-based project for real tech teams at Amazon to actually build out and have a lot better feature set than what I did. But really cool opportunities there within that role.
That's cool. You had an itch and you said, you know what? I'm going to fix this. I'm going to be good lazy and figure out an easier way to do this.
Good lazy. I'm going to have to keep that one in my back pocket.
We've been percolating that one on Underserved for a little bit now. It's a recurring theme. So you automated reports that were used by folks to run the business and start doing some data gathering and reporting?
Yeah, a lot of what I was doing there, we're doing exactly what you just described, right? Kind of backing up a little bit, right? So I started doing some of those automation reports and things as the data analyst within the organization. And that was kind of my first entry to that. But those reports and things like that were really just either for the department or for the building that I was working at. And after doing that data analyst role for a couple of years and automating myself out of that job, so to speak, I was given an opportunity to kind of join in with more of a North American software team. And as part of that role is really where I got into doing a lot more heavy manipulation of data and reporting and things like that, building the infrastructure to be able to support that. And so, when you talk about running the business, right, being able to do like pick volume, pick defect rates, all those different things that you could think of. I mean, I think there were probably 200 reports that I had to manage for all of North American fulfillment every single week. These were the metrics that ran all of our weekly business reviews, both for fulfillment and even for corporate in some ways, right? And so doing a lot of automation around that was absolutely critical. If I had to manage all those different metrics and reports by hand every single week, it would have taken me all week to do it. And that was just not going to work, right? So finding ways to actually make that, automated all the time was kind of the name of the game. Most of what we built that off of, it was all old Red Hat Linux, running Perl. Sometimes we'd even get into like Ruby, that type of thing, just to be able to go fetch all this data, dump it into our database so we could actually build some of these reports. And then for a lot of that, it's in the automated Excel files, which was just absurd to me. From there, I saw another need, right? Another itch, and started working with the team that I was on. We built out an entire Ruby on Rails. Oh, no, sorry. Our first one was actually based in PHP, a PHP portal that vended all of this data out to everyone on a weekly basis. And they could go in there and just fetch it that way instead of having to use all these old Excel files that are very prone to error. Eventually we transitioned that over to a Ruby on Rails page and got to tinker with some other types of coding languages and platforms like that. But yeah, a lot of fun building out those reports, that's for sure.
Thank you so much for joining this Zoom panel interview for our software development position. My apologies for having to reschedule it 7 times.
Hey, no worries. Ready to get this underway.
Let me introduce the panel members from our company. First is...
Whoever that is, can you please mute?
Sorry, that was me. Mailman's here.
Hey, you guys hear me? You see me? My kid is playing Fortnite and my bandwidth is sapped.
Hey, sorry, I was on mute. Hi, this is Connor Walton.
Can everyone who is not talking please mute yourself?
Sorry, so where were we?
Yeah, so the main reason I joined was to let you know that I accepted a job offer from your competitor this morning. Sorry, your process just took too long. Laters.
Does this drill sound all too familiar to you? If so, you should call Syrinx. Syrinx helps you complete your projects on time and on budget. So stop the Zoom calls and start shipping code today. Call us at 888-579-7469 option 1 or email us at sales@syrinx.com. That's sales@syrinx.com.
Now, I heard you mention in there that you're building all this on physical Red Hat servers and physical hardware, even though it's at Amazon. Did you experience any of the hardware failures, the kind of ones that are like, maybe we should be in the cloud?
Unfortunately, yes, I did experience a couple of them that were pretty painful. One I'll talk about because it was definitely the worst. I don't remember the exact year, but it was the early 2010s. And it still kind of pains me to this day. Being Amazon, having exposure to AWS, and still running on physical data center hardware that Amazon managed more privately, it just seemed wrong. And so me and one of my fellow engineers, we developed this whole plan to migrate specifically from our database layer, because even our databases were running on data center hardware. They weren't running in things like RDS or anything like that was based on AWS platforms or managed services. So we were running all these MySQL servers on these data center hosts. And at that point in time, those servers were somewhere in the neighborhood of like 5 or 6 years old. And so we kind of anticipated that we were going to have some major problems with that hardware if we didn't try to start actioning something pretty soon. But I'm sure you can imagine when you talk about supporting North American operations for Amazon, there's a lot of people impacted by the data, by the reports and things like that. And so having stability and access to that data and visibility into what's happening, paramount importance. And how do you migrate off of physical hardware into the cloud and keep your uptime at 100%? And then anybody else that is a dependency wiring right into your database or through any of your APIs, how do you manage that side of it as well and make sure that they have the opportunity to make their changes and support the new things that you're building? So we had developed this whole plan that was going to take place over about 6 months, where we would transition certain reports, certain domains, and then over time, we would just continue on the path. We published it. We were starting to work on it. And this was in a February, March timeframe. I just remember it being kind of early in the year. We started working on that. And then we kind of got told to put that on hold because there was a new project that we needed to work on. And it needed the entire team, all hands on deck for the entire summer. And we're like, okay, we'll do it. But we can't let this process of getting off this old hardware linger too long. And they're like, oh, yeah, we hear you, but we'll come back to that later. We got time. Fast forward to November that year. Still hadn't gotten back to it. The project that we spent all summer building never launched. That's the part that really pains me, is not only did we avoid a project that was valuable to us on the tech side, we substituted in one that never even saw the light of day. And that's just really painful.
You built yourself some shelfware.
Yeah, shelfware. I love that. That's such a great term. And you're absolutely right. We built some shelfware, put it up there. And then that November, when we were smack dab in the middle of our peak season, sure enough, here come those hardware failures that we were so worried about. We had in one of our core database servers, we had the hard drive just fail. And now here we are, busiest time of the year, already dealing with increased load and demand on all of our systems, increased data flow, you name it. Everything's being stressed. And now here we are having to replace hardware in the process. And at that point in time, there were no physical servers that they had available for us to just transition over to. So now we're forced to go to AWS because that was the only place that we could get hardware on such a short notice. And so now here we're forced to do a migration that we wanted to take months to do. Now we're doing it as quick as possible just because we had to get something back up and running. And we had some backups that were stored. So we at least had something to work from the data side. But the amount of work to transition all of our systems off, all of the reports, all of the different dependencies, and all of this while we're also trying to run the business for our peak season, it was nothing short of a miracle that we even got that to work. I vividly remember running over 50 hours straight just trying to get that stuff back online. Crashed real hard after that. Decided I never wanted to have another peak like that because that was terrible. Those kinds of hours they're just not good for anybody. Rough experience. And I'm sure that there are other people that have felt that pain too. And it is awful.
Well, on the bright side, you're now eating your own dog food and using the Amazon AWS to run things and auto scale with EC2 and so on. Did they make it easy to provision this stuff, or were they kind of stingy with it at first?
That's a really good question. Anytime you talk about operating costs, businesses tend to protect the dollars and cents, right? And that's a great thing to do. Want to make sure your margins are great and you're not just spending money just to spend it. But, Amazon was able to give us a little bit of freedom there. They gave us a budget to hit, but it was more than what we needed, which was always great. So we had some flexibility to learn new things and tweak and scale as we needed. And so being able to get in there, as long as we kind of hit the budget, we could just kind of do whatever we wanted. And these were all, the way we provisioned it at least was all internal to Amazon. It was some proprietary systems there. Now, I believe everybody's running truly through the public AWS management console and things like that. But at least back then, just being able to spin it up with a few button clicks, you could have capacity running in less than an hour and have a whole suite of servers out there, talking hundreds, if not thousands of them running to be able to support some of these services. And no stingy aspects to it, which was, I think, for me, kind of really getting into cloud computing at that point was probably the coolest thing. Just almost a blank check, it felt like.
But despite the blank check, you decide to move on. What's your thought process around that at the time?
Yeah, so Amazon's a great company. It is tough. You hear a lot of bad press and you hear a lot of good press. And there's probably some truth in the middle. My personal experience was that, it was demanding, but the work was worth it. What you could get out of it, the learnings that you could have, the opportunities that come with that, I think those were pretty incredible. I feel like the time I spent there was, so incredibly formative to how I do things today. Just being able to kind of grow up in that scale. Some things that just kind of feel natural to me probably don't even dawn on some people if they didn't have to deal with supporting, 200 buildings. And then how do you even manage that much data and people and access and all those different things? And so being able to grow up in that, it was a really, really great experience. But Amazon is, in my opinion, there's one aspect that really kind of irritates me. And that's the fact that to kind of really unlock all of your future potential there, you do have to have a completed college degree. And I'm very abnormal in that way when it comes to software engineering. I never actually finished my degree. I started getting involved with these different companies and had a lot of on-the-job training, and I learned a lot in that way. And coming out of that kind of an environment felt like I was learning more than what I would if I just went to school. So I just decided to not finish. And then as I progressed through my career and actually got some opportunities and really started to see what things were going to be like in the future for Amazon and for me there, I realized that my opportunities were going to be limited. I could only go so far. And I just kind of saw the writing on the wall, like, this isn't going to be the place long term for me. I don't think I'm going to be able to really continue to grow because of this outlook on people and just say, hey, if you don't have a college degree, you're not going to get this opportunity. And I feel like that's antiquated thinking, especially this day and age. There are a lot of people that have a lot of knowledge that they've learned from non-traditional education, especially on the job. I feel like I've learned more on the job than what I ever could have from a book. And so when I looked at my career and what I wanted, I look forward to other things like, hey, here's an opportunity that may or may not care if I have that completed degree. They're going to look at what I offer the business, what value I bring to the table. An opportunity to go work at Chewy.com actually came up. I was able to take a little bit of a promotion in terms of title and things like that. By making that transition, I figured, hey, this is a great time. Let's get out. They don't really care whether or not I've got a degree. They're looking at the true value that I can bring. And the experience that I had at Amazon gave me a foundation that is just unparalleled in that way, especially when you talk about fulfillment and logistics, right? Being able to come from that as Amazon is kind of like the gold standard and being able to apply all of that experience to Chewy, who was relatively young at the time. I saw that as a really neat opportunity to just have upward mobility, make a real impact on the business and things like that. So decided to make the leap, try something new.
Can you confirm or deny the rumor that your Jack Russell Terrier Dexter actually talked you into going to Chewy?
I unfortunately had to sign some paperwork. I have to be quiet about that. So
we got those boxes showing up all the time, and our dogs go nuts when the chew toys come out of there.
It's great, isn't it? Everybody loves having their dog just bark and go crazy. It's really neat to see that dogs can recognize a logo just like us humans can. They see a Chewy box and they're like, oh, it's delivery day. How exciting is that?
What would you say is the biggest technological difference between Amazon and Chewy in your experience?
Really, this applies a whole lot more to the first probably year and a half of my Chewy tenure, more so than the latter half. But just the ease of access to compute technology. At that time, Chewy was not running anything in the cloud. Everything was on-prem data center style hosts. And I remember putting in a request to get just a single server, single Linux server that I could just do some basic proof of concept development on and be able to actually have a place to kind of spin up some servers for other people to test and work with it. And they told me it was going to be 6 weeks. And my heart just kind of sank. I was like, 6 weeks? And they're like, oh, yeah. And you have to have all these approvals to be able to get the hardware ordered and installed. And my heart is just aching at that point because I was coming from an environment where if I needed 1,000 servers, I just had to click a few extra buttons and hit go, and it just worked. And here I am begging for something, and they're telling me it's going to take months. And I'm just like, what did I do? Why did I make this kind of a choice?
You can take your credit card to Best Buy, get a PC, install Red Hat, be up and running.
Yeah, by the end of the day, right? And it was rough to say the least. Now, fast forward, Chewy is all running on AWS publicly, and things are drastically different today than what they were several years ago. But that was probably the biggest difference for me, is just being, just pained at how slow things had to move, just because they just weren't as mature of an organization at that time.
What sort of things are you working on and building over there for them? I imagine you're taking the know-how from Amazon around time and attendance and logistics and making all that stuff work.
You're absolutely correct on that. Time and attendance was kind of a big aspect of what the team that I was on and what we focused on. So one of the first major projects that I got tasked with, and it was maybe 5 or so months into my tenure there, was kind of building from a ground up an entire labor management system that would interface both with all of our warehouse management, even into our time and attendance servers and things like that, to be able to track who's on the clock and when and all the things, and be able to add a whole nother layer of configuration on top of that to bring flexibility in both how we track things, but then also how we report and how we make our business decisions based off of what's really happening within our warehouse or warehouses. And so being able to build something from the ground up of that magnitude and with that kind of impact was a really cool experience. Being able to interface with the raw, production level data coming from all of our warehouse servers and being able to track all of these millions and millions of transactions happening every single day, and then make some sense of it so that a person could look at a page and say, yep, we did really good this shift. And here's how we could maybe do better next time because we did have some weak areas, or, hey, we're way off course and we got a half a shift left. Like, what transitions can we make here? What moves can we make with our personnel to hit some of our goals for the shift? And being able to have that kind of an impact at the organizational level was just an incredible experience. That was really kind of the first time I had something that was that ingrained with daily operations. I had a lot of reporting and things like that at Amazon, but those weren't necessarily used real time to make real time decisions and say, yeah, this person needs to move over here, that person needs to go over there, that type of thing. And so it was always more retroactive. I look at Monday's data on Tuesday and make some decisions from there. But being able to get into the real-time aspect of saying, hey, Jim or Susie or Karen over there, they're working kind of slow. Let's go talk to them. Or, hey, as a whole shift, we're 80% above where we needed to be. This is amazing. Let's make sure everybody gets positive praise. That type of stuff. It was just a really cool experience to get involved in that.
Nice. So what are you up to these days at Rude Gilt Group?
Very different from everything else that I've talked about. All the way up to that point, till this new position, I've been in the logistics and fulfillment space and metrics and reporting and things like that that all support that. Here at Rue, I'm now leading up our entire retail systems team. And retail systems is kind of a generic phrasing, but if you think of all of the services that need to back an e-commerce storefront, there's a lot that has to go into that. Things like order management, payments, tax, fraud, customer service, like all of that, you support software that has to happen to make things go from, hey, I want this pretty dress or these Ray-Ban sunglasses, all the way down to, hey, we've got this in the warehouse. How do we get it out the door? Right. Being able to be that middle layer between those two things is a really interesting and new thing for me. So getting a step closer to kind of the customer experience, being able to do things that impact how a customer interfaces with our site, how they experience our workflows and all the way up until when it's delivered, even some things post delivery. It's just focusing on an entire different aspect of the e-commerce portfolio that I just never really got a chance to do.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've moved to the front end of an order. How do we make it easy for them to find what they want and do faceted search and stuff that shopping cart and upsell and cross sell? And
a lot of good stuff in there. Some of the things you mentioned there, right? Like, you talk about recommendations and things like that. The way we're kind of structured at Rue, that kind of falls under some of the storefront aspects, like the bigger domain of storefront. But the data that they use certainly is coming from the systems that my team and my org supports. So it's a pretty neat thing to get that much closer to customer experience.
Now, when you're away from keyboard, I know you like to enjoy some fine brown liquor with friends and came up with a novel way to do so during the pandemic.
I think the pandemic certainly gave everybody some new creative spirits, and I'm not immune to that.
Oh, spirits. I see what you did there.
Yeah, you like that? That was pun intended. But yeah, when we started doing the whole work from home thing at the beginning of the pandemic, everybody's sitting behind their computer all day using Zoom or Teams or WebEx or whatever platform. Insert your choice here, or I guess your company's choice here. When you start looking at all the time spent behind the computers, okay, well, I get to experience a little bit of what it means to be an employee at an organization and have coworkers in this virtual sense. So why can't I use the same thing to do something with my friends? I don't get to go see them. I'm not traveling right now. We're not getting a chance to even do these things. And phone calls and texting, it helps, but let's see each other. Let's actually do something fun. Let's not just keep it traditional communication. And so we started doing a lot of these different like whiskey blinds and spreading around all of these different samples. I'm not going to talk about how samples got shared, but samples got shared and they were all blind. And we'd set rules and things like, okay, hey, this time maybe we want to do a rye whiskey that's 5 years old or older, minimum of 100 proof or something like that. Just set some crazy rules and see what people come up with. And you share the samples and everybody hops onto a Zoom and just starts sharing tasting notes and and kind of sharing the drinking experience virtually. It's a weird change, not being able to do that kind of thing in person and being able to open the same bottle and experience it right there. But, being able to share it in this way was certainly a good consolation prize, in my opinion, especially over the last couple of years.
Now, you've been a part of the YouTube channel Barn Night at Home, right? Barnnight.com. Is that where you guys do this?
It is. So the crew that runs that YouTube channel, it's 4 of my buddies, and working with them here recently, I've actually started getting a little bit more involved. But one of the cool things that I had a chance to do was come up with my own whiskey blind, not just do it with like 3 or 4 people and have rules to it, but me as an individual, let me go curate a whole selection of whiskey and have some fun in that way. Being able to share some things that maybe other people haven't had a chance to get a hold of, because if you're not in the whiskey world, it's hard to find certain things, especially depending on what part of the country you're in and whether you're an allocated whiskey or not. It can be really difficult to find certain products. And so I had a few of those things sitting on my shelf that I've had for a while. And I'm like, okay, how can I share this type of thing with some people that really enjoy it? And I know are going to actually look at this and understand what they're getting a chance to taste here. And so I started working with the guys there for Barn Night at Home. And I developed a 15 whiskey blind and opened it up to quite a few people. Actually was able to do a full live YouTube stream sharing all of the different results, right? People's tasting notes, how they rated it, in comparison to some of the other whiskeys and what their guesses were. Surprisingly enough, some people got some of the guesses correct and other people didn't. They were way far off, but the whole experience of being able to be online live, sharing this experience and being able to kind of share the results of this blind with everybody, it was probably one of the coolest things that the pandemic has kind of brought out with this group. And the guys at Bar Night at Home, just absolutely fantastic. If you ever get a chance, look at some of their videos. They publish pretty consistently. And so just really cool to be involved with the group like that has something kind of really going.
Yeah, that's cool. I checked them out and noted the rye thing in particular. Living here in the Northeast, I've become quite partial to Whistle Pig, the rye out of Vermont. Can you tell me some other ones I may not have heard of that might be some sleeper hits in the rye category?
In the rye category, honestly, I'm not a huge rye guy myself, but a few that really just kind of get me going. If you've ever had a chance to get some Thomas H. Handy rye, which is part of the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection, a little harder to find, a little expensive if you can find it, but if you ever can, totally worth it. That's not really much of a sleeper. Some of the other sleepers, honestly, none come to mind, but if there's one aspect of finding some sleepers that I could share, it's all of your local liquor stores, or at least some of them, are probably going to be involved in some sort of a barrel picking program. And if you can find a store pick, like where someone in your local store or in their ownership chain decided, hey, this rye whiskey is one that I like, I want this bottled, buy that. Because I promise you it's going to be better than most things you're going to be able to find on the shelf.
Okay, a local store's barrel pick. I'll have to check that out. There's a couple near me that I bet do that. Conrad, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experiences with the listeners of Underserved.
Thanks, Andrew. It was a pleasure being here and just kind of reminiscing about all these different experiences. So thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome. And we'll talk to everyone soon on the next episode of Underserved.
Thank you for listening to the Underserved podcast. For more information on the topics discussed and for show notes, visit the show website, underserved.fm. And please be sure to rate, like, and subscribe to Underserved on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.